Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're at across the country or even across the globe. I know we have lots of people that tune in from around the world for different webinars and things we put on. So, from wherever you're attending from, welcome. I'm grateful you're here. This is my first ever live stream on LinkedIn. I know we're pushing to a bunch of different channels here as well, but I'm really grateful to be with you. Grateful for your time today as we talk about a brand new report that we have put out. Started to trickle out a little bit last week, and this is really sort of the public reveal today of what we call the digital first fundraising benchmark. A little bit of background and a little bit of context is we've been talking about putting out a report like this for the better part of a year and a half or so. And it's very hard sometimes to go look across all the different organizations we work with and roll up all of the data. It's a Herculean lift on the data analysis side to try to look at all these different data sources from different systems and different tools and stitch them together to see kind of cohesively what's happening in the bigger picture. But that's what we've been working on, and I'm glad to be able to share with you today. My name is Nathan Hill. I oversee what we call the Next After Institute. And at Next After, our mission is to decode what works in fundraising and go equip as many people as we possibly can with what we're learning. Because ultimately, our vision is to unleash the most generous generation in the history of the world. We're never going to do that if we hold all of the learnings to ourselves, just to us at Next After and to the organizations we work with day to day. We want to equip you and as many fundraisers as we possibly can with what's working so we can see generosity grow and increase. So today what we're going to do is we are going to dive into this digital first fundraising benchmark. We don't have enough time to go through every single thing. I'm not going to read you every line of the report. You can go grab the link benchmarks.nextafter.com to go read through the full report. But we're going to give some highlights. I'll give you plenty of time to ask questions. I'm going to plan to spend the next about 20 minutes or so kind of going through high level some of the key things that we've been learning as we went through this benchmark report process. Feel free to drop in any of your thoughts, ideas, comments, and questions as we go. If I can pause and clarify something, I would love to do that. If there's bigger questions, broader questions, we'll keep track of those, and I'll come back at the end and make sure that we get you some answers. So again, I'll spend about the next 20 minutes or so going through high level the report, and then I'll let you sort of steer us from there with wherever you want to dive into. I see this good quote from Cooper. So appreciative of all the work Next After is doing to share learnings and best practices in the nonprofit space. Been sharing the insights regularly with both my church and local Christian school. And that's exactly what our heart is to take those learnings, share them far and wide, whether you're working in a local school setting, you're working in a ministry, you're working in an organization trying to solve things like climate change and disaster relief, whatever your kind of vertical or space is. We're here to serve you and equip you. And so that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up this report, and we're going to start to go through it. Again, if you've got comments, thoughts, ideas, questions, drop them in a LinkedIn comment, or if you're on Facebook or YouTube, drop them in the comments. We'll try to keep track of all of those and get you some answers. A little bit about this report. And I think I'm trying to perceive there might be some questions about, who's in the report and what's the purpose of it. You might be tired of seeing new industry benchmark reports. In fact, anytime a new report comes out that I haven't seen before, I haven't heard of, I kind of roll my eyes a little bit, quite honestly. It's like, okay, do we really need another benchmark report? There are so many in our space. We're inundated with so many benchmarks. What do I do with them? And so why on earth would we actually create another one? And there's a few things that we're trying to solve with this, because on the one hand, you've got these large industry reports that pretty much measure giving trends. And sometimes they're looking at offline giving, online giving, they're looking at individual giving, major giving, all different things measuring just kind of the state of philanthropy. And there's a ton of value that you can get from those reports. But there's a problem that we sometimes run into when we compare our performance as an organization, as a nonprofit, to just sort of the industry averages, which is that if we're trying to grow, if we're trying to actually see our results move up and to the right so we can have better impact, greater impact on our causes, we don't want to just compare to what the average is, because that's essentially is the status quo. And if we're content with the status quo, we're never going to see giving move in a significant way. And so what we're trying to do with this report is give you a sample of organizations that are seeing rapid growth using a unified methodology. They're all applying what we're calling digital first fundraising to see growth. So you can compare your organization to organizations that are seeing rapid growth and see how you stack up and how you compare. The second piece is that there are some reports that do some similar things where they're diving a little bit deeper into strategies and things like that. But at the end of the day, most of those reports rely largely on survey data. And I know firsthand, maybe you've seen this too, but I certainly know firsthand from previous reports we've tried to put together using survey data, is that the data you get back is oftentimes really messy. It's not very clean. People tend to inflate their metrics when they're self-reporting them, when you're not actually looking at live data, because we all want to be proud of our results. And so we're going to share the best of the best that we have. And sometimes it means we're not quite as honest as maybe we should be about the performance. And so that's the other piece that this is trying to solve, is looking at live data, real data across a wide variety of data sources, web analytics, advertising performance data, looking at Google advertising, Facebook or Meta advertising, lots of different channels there, looking at CRM data and stitching that all together so you can see the real life performance of these organizations and see how you compare and stack up. So that's just kind of some setting the table, some background information on this report. And probably the key question that's remaining is, what the heck does it mean to be a digital first organization? What does digital first fundraising mean? And quite honestly, it's something that we're actively working to codify, because there's a part of this that's just in our DNA. We live and breathe in the digital world, and that's where we spend most of our time working with organizations every single day, is how do we optimize digital fundraising and donation pages and advertising and emails and all sorts of things online. But what we've started to notice is that these organizations making a significant investment in digital are actually doing a lot of different things in order to make it work. They're not just bolting on a digital strategy. They're not just bolting on emails and advertising to a direct mail program. They're actually reorienting their systems, their tools, their processes, their strategies, their methodologies. In many cases, they're hiring and their staffing plans, recognizing that we live in a digital world where the primary channel that most people are engaging with on an active basis starts with digital. Whether you're Gen Z or you're a boomer or above, almost everybody has at least some sort of connected device where we're actively engaging with media, with organizations, with businesses in a digital way. And so these organizations are reorienting their processes, people, systems, all sorts of things around using digital to lift all channels. That's a key piece that I hope that you take away and understand after today, is that we're not talking about just replacing offline revenue with digital revenue. We're talking about using digital channels to lift all channels, to lift your full program and actually see better results overall. So all that said, let's dive into some of the data. As we do that, I'm seeing a bunch of different comments coming in, people from all over the place. Hello, John Walsh from North Carolina. We've got Beth from Maine and North Carolina representing. I'm not sure how you're in two places at once, but go for it. That's great. Cool. We've got folks from Utah. We've got people from Colorado Springs. I saw a comment from Denver, all over the place here. A few Canadians in the house. Whoop, whoop. Thanks for being here. All right, we're scrolling down on this report. The first thing that I want to point out, and kind of the overarching result that we're seeing from these digital first organizations is this, that digital first nonprofits and organizations are growing 12.7% faster than the average nonprofit. So this group of organizations using this kind of unified methodology of digital first are outpacing the industry trend. I'll scroll down and show you some of these results here. This chart is basically rolling up all the year-over-year revenue from this sample of organizations, and you can see, from one year to the next, sometimes it's a little bit flat. 2019 to 2020 is pretty much the same. There's a big jump in 2021. Most organizations saw a bit of a decline in 2022, and then things grew again in 2023. But as we measure the year-over-year growth over this 5-year span, on average, digital first organizations are seeing a 6.2% growth rate year over year. What our friends at Giving USA report for the average individual giving growth rate, as they measure giving year over year, they're saying the average organization is seeing 5.5% increase in individual giving, which means, again, digital first organizations are outpacing the average. Which is fascinating. It's interesting. And the question is, well, how's that working and why? And what's actually leading to those results? And that's what we'll start to unpack here. So as we scroll down and we get deeper into some of the data, This is an interesting, probably not the most shocking observation, but worth diving into, is that online revenue growth is outpacing offline revenue growth for the past 5 years for these digital first organizations. Again, you may say, like, that's not the most shocking thing. I know that online's growing. I know it's growing rapidly, but there's a couple key things in here that we need to note. First of all, is the difference in growth rates. Online revenue over the past 5 years for these organizations has grown at a rate of 99%. And that's compared to offline, which is not declining. Now, I think some common thinking around, well, if I'm going to make a shift and start investing in digital, is it just sort of grabbing offline revenue and moving it online? And is it really worth it? Well, the reality is these organizations that are investing in a digital first approach are seeing growth in both channels. 99% 5-year growth rate for online revenue, 36% overall offline revenue growth rate. So both are moving up and to the right. The other thing I want you to note about this is if you can kind of draw some imaginary trend lines, if you will, look at the yellow bars, which is the offline revenue. Draw your trend line, extrapolate that out. It's going to run off the side of the screen. Do the same thing with the green line. You can sort of imagine here that these trend lines are starting to come together. In fact, if we see these current trends hold on growth of both of these channels, in about 5 or 6 years, they're going to start to cross, which is going to be a really major shift for our industry to actually see online revenue start to eclipse on a broader basis, eclipse offline revenue. And again, that's not saying that digital is just stealing money out of the offline basket. They're both growing, but digital is growing at a much more rapid pace. And so my hope for you is that before that cross happens, before that shift happens, that you've put the essential things in place to build a healthy foundation in order to take advantage of the natural growth in digital, to actually help see that move even further up and to the right, and to be in a position where 6 years from now, you're not just starting to think about, oh, I guess we should probably have a stronger donation tool, we should build an email program. We need to have that stuff in place now so we can see the growth now and be ready for that major shift that's going to happen in our industry over the next 5 to 10 years. Again, lots of data that we could drill into and dive into. A couple other interesting things on sort of this overarching growth category. As we drill in over the past 5 years, looking at kind of year-over-year differences, year-over-year changes, one thing that we saw, and that you probably observed too, is that digital-first organizations saw pretty explosive growth during the pandemic. Now, many organizations, I'll say, saw growth during the pandemic, during 2021. I'll show you this quick little stat here. In 2021, according to Giving USA, individual giving grew by 5.6%. So that's about that same kind of year-over-year average that we saw, a little bit higher. These digital-first organizations saw growth to the tune of 22.5% in 2021. Because when all of the sort of in-person channels, events and face-to-face fundraising and all that sort of stuff went away, they had the infrastructure in place, the methodology, the practices, the tactics, the strategies, the tools in place already to be able to pivot a lot faster. And just in general, by investing in digital, that gives you greater opportunity to be more agile and to go change course when you realize that something isn't working. So God forbid we don't have another major pandemic in the near future, but there are going to be other things that come up that are going to cause you to need to make strategic pivots, whether it's slow economy type of things that are happening. Maybe you've been investing in one strategy over here, it's just not working. We need to be agile enough to be able to shift our approach quickly, learn some new things about what might lead to the next big leap in growth. And oftentimes that's going to come through digital strategies and through a digital investment. A digital first approach allows you to be much more agile and pivot faster when things get hard or tricky or just stop working as well as they've worked in the past. Fast forward to 2022, well, the picture started to change for most nonprofits, where many people were celebrating this huge growth in 2021. In 2022, most organizations saw a dip in giving, and many were concerned about it, and rightfully so. But the reality is a lot of the dip in giving in 2022 was largely a result of people who typically make major donations not being quite willing to part with say $100,000 gift during a time where inflation is rapidly on the rise and there's fears of recession and all that sort of stuff going on in the marketplace. Typically when that happens, major giving slows down. And as a result, many organizations saw a dip in giving. What's really interesting, though, is that these digital first organizations were actually able to grow their online broad-based giving by 5% during 2022, even when these kind of mid and major donor channels weren't quite doing as well as they did the previous few years. In fact, what we saw, according to Giving USA, giving dipped by 6.4% in 2022. These digital first organizations they also saw a dip, but it was less of a dip. They weathered the storm a little bit better. It was only a 3.9% dip in giving when things got hard with the state of the economy and inflation and all of that stuff. And the other thing I want you to know that's related is that these organizations are not investing in digital and sacrificing a mid-level program or sacrificing a major giving program. In fact, digital first fundraising can actually fuel the pipeline for major donors down the road. Some just high level stats on this for you. You can see sort of the growth trends of mid and major over the past 5 years. And there's a little bit more kind of tumultuous nature to it. Again, largely because of some of those economic fears in 2022 and even in 2023, even though we saw things grow a little bit there. These organizations across the board are seeing growth over this 5-year span. Both channels, mid-level and major, are growing. And what's really interesting, at least to me, is where some of the growth is coming from. Revenue growth from offline major donors was 16% over that 5-year time span. But interestingly enough, online major donors is actually growing too, and growing at a significant rate. It's a small slice of the pie, but the growth is 58% over a 5-year period. So more and more people that are giving in this kind of major donor category are actually choosing to give online, which is a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. I'm not suggesting that, in the next 10 years, the majority of your major donations are coming in online, but it's worth noting that more people are shifting that way. And there may be an opportunity to use online and digital channels to cultivate those major donor relationships because they're engaging in that channel already. Even if the majority of your fundraising conversations are happening face to face, we can still cultivate using digital content and using digital channels. So there's a ton there on sort of the overall growth trends. There's a lot to dive into there. I want to hit a few highlights in some of these other sections as well. We won't spend nearly as much time in each one of these as we just did in sort of the overarching trends here, but I want to hit on a couple highlights that I think are fascinating because there's a few common myths to, I would say, traditional fundraising thinking that I want to dispel and that this data starts to dispel. Before we move on, I see a couple comments, particularly one asking, how do you define major donor? And what we did for the sake of this report is actually allow the organization to define it. So we didn't normalize it so that it's equal across every single organization, because the way you define a major donor is different than probably every other organization defines major donors. Generally speaking, the cutoff for most of these organizations, if you give above $1,000 is when you start to hit into that mid-level category. If you give above $5,000 is typically where you start to hit the major level. For some organizations, it's more like a $10,000 cap to actually hit the major. Again, we let the organizations tell us how they define it, and then we use that in our data set to kind of measure the growth rates. Hopefully that's helpful clarification. We'll scroll down and we'll check out what's going on in donor acquisition, because there's a lot to look at here in donor acquisition. There's a common myth in traditional kind of fundraising thinking, maybe you've heard it before, that online donors just aren't nearly as valuable as offline donors. Are they really worth making the investment in if it's cheaper for me to go, or the value of an offline donor is much higher, even though it might be cheaper to acquire them online? Is it really worth it? What we have found in the data is a very different narrative and a very different story. Because in 2023, online acquired donors were actually 48% more valuable than offline acquired donors. I'll just pause and let you think on that for a second. I'll say it one more time. Donors who were acquired online in 2023 were 48% more valuable than donors who were acquired in an offline channel. There's a variety of reasons for this, and we'll drill into them. But overarching, what I want you to know is that if you're not seeing this type of a trend in your own organization, it might mean you don't have the right strategies for online acquisition in place, or maybe you don't have the right strategies for online cultivation in place to allow these people to maybe have the chance to give again, or to see the opportunity to give, say, a second gift or give it a greater level. But we see this increased value in two main places. The first is, well, here's the overall kind of pie chart splits here in terms of revenue from these two different channels. You can see online is greater than offline here. But the two main reasons for it, first of all, new online donors were giving larger first donations than new offline donors. So their average gift size was actually higher. And secondly, as we scroll down here, and again, there's more experiments to look at, lots of data to look at here. But this is really interesting to me too, is that new online donors were actually more likely to give a second gift within their first year than new offline donors. So they're giving more when they first give, and they're more likely to give to you again. Now, keep in mind, this is all dependent upon having the right, kind of digital acquisition strategy and approach, and having the right methodologies in place and practices in place to cultivate these people over time and to cultivate them effectively in digital channels so that they might give to you again. It's worth noting too that if someone gives to you again a second time or more in their first year, their likelihood of retaining into the next year, I have the note in here, is 114% increase in their likelihood to retain into year two if they give you that second gift. So if they're acquired online, larger first gifts, a larger chance of getting them to give a second gift in their first year, which means that you have a greater chance of retaining them into their second year. And if you can do that, they have a greater chance of becoming a key multi-year donor, which is your most valuable donor. So let's dispel the myth that online donors are not as valuable, because what the data says, if you have the right approach and the right strategy, they might actually be your most valuable channel. Let's scroll down. Let's look a bit at retention, because there's some interesting things here too. The other side of the coin of these kind of like traditional fundraising, I would say, myths is that, well, okay, maybe they're valuable in the short term, but they're not going to retain as long as an offline donor. They just don't have the same level of commitment. And we don't find that to be true either, again, with the right type of strategy and approach. There's really minimal difference in retention rates when you look at the retention rates of new online and new offline donors. I'll scroll down to this chart for you and highlight a couple things. You see the blue bar is kind of all in between both channels what the new donor retention rate is. The green bar is online, the yellow bar is offline. You can see in 2021, offline is technically a little bit better in terms of donor retention rates for these new donors, but it's marginal compared to online. You jump to 2022 and it actually flips. Online donors retained a little bit better, a marginal amount better than offline. 2023, it flips again. Offline donors retain a marginal amount better than online donors. So year over year, it can fluctuate, it can change, but at the end of the day, the difference between retention rates for these new donors is minimal. So let's not believe this idea that online donors aren't willing to give for the long term or retain. We actually see that there's very minimal difference. In fact, when we actually look at overall donor retention rates for these digital first organizations, the overarching finding here is pretty fascinating. And I'll scroll down so you can see this. The industry average is reported by a lot of different sources. I have a link to a Bloomberg report in here that shows kind of the overarching retention rates over the past 5-6 years. Actually, I think going back to 2016 is what they report on. And it starts at about 45% and it's kind of slowly fading and going down. So best case scenario, industry average is about 45% for overall retention across all donor segments. What we found is that in 2023, digital first organizations, the average retention rate was 52.8. So it is significantly outpacing the industry average for overall donor retention. In fact, there are a couple that were close here to be this top performer in the data set. But our number one top performer had an 86% retention rate for their entire fundraising program, which is incredible. It's incredible. And so what I'd impress upon you is that you can use a digital approach to not just cultivate online donors, but to actually cultivate and steward your whole file of donors, online, offline, multi-year, lapsed donors, reactivated donors, all of them. You can lead with digital to cultivate those relationships so that they retain longer into the future. Now, I told you we'd spend about 20 minutes going through the report, and I'd give you some time to ask questions, and I want to be true to that. So I'll hit just a couple highlights here as we scroll down. We've got lots of data here on kind of key metrics related to an online fundraising program. It's a quick way to measure your digital program is to look at, what's your monthly web traffic, what's your conversion rate, how many people that show up actually are giving, and then what's the average gift size, because the combination of those three things multiplied together gives you your revenue. And so we've got some benchmarks here on monthly web traffic and what to do if maybe you're outperforming even this benchmark. What might that mean for your organization and where you're at in your sort of stage of growth? And same thing for conversion rates and for average gift size, what all these metrics mean, how you can think about them. So you can dive into that at your own pace, at your own leisure. We pulled out for me, one of the most critical questions I wanted to make sure we answered is, what's a healthy donation page conversion rate? Because there's lots of benchmarks on kind of overarching conversion rates that exist out there. Granted, many of them come from survey data, so take it for what it's worth. This one, we dove into what we would consider the three main types of donation pages. You've got main donation pages, you've got campaign donation pages, you've got instant donation pages. You can drill into what those three different use cases are. We're actually developing a brand new course that kind of outlines what those three are and what to think about those pages. But here's what we find. We'll just look at main donation pages for a second. On average, the average donation page conversion rate for a main donation page is 13.5%. Again, this is based on real data across this subset of digital first organizations and what they're seeing. But you can see that, if you go send an email appeal with a dedicated campaign donation page, you're likely going to see something greater than just your main donation page conversion rates, more around 16 to 17%. And then there's this instant donation page, which is something we often use in new donor acquisition, paired with some sort of email offer. Our expectations for conversion are much lower for that type of a page, more around the 4.3%. So there's some good benchmarks here to reference as you kind of investigate different types of strategies and approaches in your fundraising. And I wanted to spend just a couple minutes here on advertising, because one of the key distinctives of a digital first fundraising organization is that by and large, the majority of them are investing significantly in digital advertising. And for some people, that's scary. You might say, we don't have budget for that, or we try to use the Google ad grant, and that's about it, and we're trying to just make the most of that. The reality is that typically isn't enough, and we have to carve off significant budgets to become a digital first organization. You've seen all the overarching performance. You can see what it can lead to. But then the question is, how do you figure out how much you actually need to spend? And so we've got some guidelines in here around that. We break down kind of what our typical approach is to new donor acquisition, which is where the bulk of digital advertising spend is going. I won't break that down for you today just because we don't have time, but we got a whole course that dives into that and blogs and things like that too. We got some experiments to show impact of that approach in a variety of channels. But at the end of the day, what we found is that the average organization, the average digital first organization, is spending 2.7% of their total giving on digital advertising. So they're reinvesting that portion of donations that are coming in into largely into acquisition to go acquire new donors. But also sometimes a percentage of that is being invested in more like branded advertising, over the top, trying to influence things like retention rates as well. We talked about at the very beginning, we never want to just compare to the average and think that we're okay just because we're meeting the benchmark. Woohoo! You might be in a totally different stage than an organization that's spending about 2% of their giving on digital advertising. In fact, when we look at the splits on all the different organizations in our data set, they're all kind of at different stages. In fact, we kind of identified four major groups. There's these ones that are in the top left here. Their spend is a little bit more aggressive and their performance is maybe a little bit lower. They're in kind of this aggressive growth stage where they're spending a pretty sizable chunk on digital advertising to build a foundation of donors. You've got the purple down here in the bottom left quadrant. They're more in this kind of building the program stage where they're less aggressive in their spend. Their performance might vary. It's typically lower because they're trying to dial in. Now, what's the right approach? What's the right strategy? What are the right content offers I should be using? How do we optimize that before we make the decision to go up and to the right and spend more money? We want to have the approach dialed in. You've got this kind of ready to invest category, the blue here in the bottom right, where we're in that stage of building the program, and now they're seeing significant ROI on their campaigns. And so they're at the point of needing to make the decision of, I should probably go a little bit more all in, spend a little bit more money, be a little bit more aggressive to see more of this sustained growth. And that's the final category, the green up here, is they've kind of found this sweet spot of how much should I be spending paired with a healthy ROI for sustained digital growth going up into the right, acquiring new donors that have significant lifetime value, they retain for years to come. And so they've kind of found, again, that sweet spot. So don't just go with the average, but consider, where are you on even a chart like this? What stage of growth might you be in, and what's right for you? Because it might be 2% of giving that you should go reinvest, but also you might find yourself as this little guy up here, way off the chart. This organization is spending 64% of their giving that comes in, reinvesting it back in digital advertising, and seeing a 61% instant ROI. So it's this little Easter egg hanging out up here, way off the chart, which is pretty incredible. And then down below, and I'll let you explore this on your own, is some kind of key benchmarks around digital advertising performance. Lots of people don't like to publish these because I think people want to kind of keep it an industry secret, and it's their secret sauce and their secret flavor of what's going to work. We want to share this far and wide and share this with you, so you have a good benchmark to reference as to, how do I know that my campaigns are actually performing at a decent rate? And so each one of these different metrics here is a key metric that we use to try to figure out, how do we optimize a donor acquisition campaign. And we've given you some minimum targets, which is not the target, it's the bare minimum to make sure your campaign is kind of going on the right track. But we've also given you a top performer in each category, so that you can see that I don't just want to aim for the minimum, but the sky is the limit on what I can actually do with this campaign. Because the mentality that we take in everything that we do is, how do we make it a little bit better? How do we optimize it? How do we start to grow this result? If our click-through rate is at 4%, how do we get it to a 5%? If our ROI is at, we'll scroll down to the bottom here, ROI is at 30%, can we get it to a 35? Can we get it to a 40? Can we get it to this top performer that saw 100% ROI on their ad campaigns for the entirety of 2023? That's incredible. Could we outperform that? Let's optimize it and see if we can find out. So that's our whole mentality, and I hope you take that away from this, is we, again, shouldn't be comparing just to the average and to the status quo, because if we do so, we are only ever going to be at the status quo. We need to figure out, how do we get results moving up and to the right by trying and testing a different approach. We call that approach digital first fundraising. I'd love to spend some time breaking that down more with you, and that's kind of what we're going to do with the remainder of our time here. We've got a ton of questions and I love it. We may not have time to get to every single question, but I'm going to go ahead and take a look at a handful of them and see if we can answer a few. So thank you again for being here. Thank you for making some time out of your day to look through this report with me. Hopefully so far it's been insightful. Again, there's a bunch of other data points and things to dive into. You can go do that yourself at benchmarks.nextafter.com. Go explore the whole thing. But again, I see some questions. Michelle is asking, will this be shared later so our teams can listen? Yes, we are recording this. I believe it lives on LinkedIn as well, so you can go watch it back. But we'll definitely have the recording that we post on YouTube and things like that, so we can share with you, and that you can share with other people if you found it interesting. So the answer to your question, Michelle, is a resounding yes. Let's see, a question from David. We started seeing, or maybe a comment, we started seeing digital acquisition surpass offline acquisition last year. This year, moving to 56% for several clients. Huge growth. That's awesome, David. And we're seeing the same thing. When we looked at kind of those growth trends, we're looking at kind of all in, not just new donor acquisition, but the full program. And so that's where we're starting to see those lines start to come together. But certainly on the acquisition side, it depends on the level of comfortability of the organization and how much they want to invest. But there's a very real world right now where if you make an intentional investment in donor acquisition, you should be putting a lot of that spend into digital donor acquisition for all the reasons that we just looked at. But certainly that's where the majority of growth is happening for these organizations. We saw the online revenue growth rate is like 99%, offline revenue growth rate is like 36%. So both growing, but digital is certainly outpacing it. So good to see that you're seeing very similar trends as well. That's awesome. Okay, an anonymous LinkedIn user here. I never love anonymous questions, but let's see what we got. Can you share more about who these participating organizations are? What industries are they in? There's a pretty good variety of industries represented. I don't have it outlined in the benchmark report exactly, but there's a mix. There's advocacy organizations, policy organizations, there's higher ed organizations that are in this data set. There's missions organizations, faith-based organizations. They're doing all sorts of work around the globe. There's some more like localized organizations. So even though the sample size is maybe quote unquote small compared to some of the larger industry reports, there's 27 organizations we're zeroing in here on. but the mix of verticals is pretty varied. So that's an important note too, is that this is not just limited to like one specific vertical, one specific type of cause. Again, a wide variety of causes that are being impacted using this similar type of methodology around their fundraising programs. All right, let's see. We got a question from Gene. What tools do you need to have in place in order to start or increase your digital fundraising? That is a very long answer, and also it starts with the two best consulting words that exist, which is it depends. But there's definitely some critical things that you need. Obviously, you need a solid CRM tool, and certainly many organizations have a CRM tool. But questions I would ask is like, how does it integrate with other tools that you have? Are you able to get data in and get data out without having to go manually go key in information or run imports and exports? Can you use tools like Zapier to pull data in, push data out in an automated fashion? We talked about kind of one of the key words of a digital first program is agile. We have to be able to quickly pivot. In order to do that, we have to be able to automate some things. So we need modern tools that allow for you to get data in and data out in automated ways. On the email side of things, which is another kind of critical place to make sure you have the right tools in place. There's a lot of things we could look at. Typically, we're recommending one of two different platforms. Granted, we work in almost every single platform that's out there, although it feels like there's a new email tool that pops up every single day. But the two platforms that we typically recommend, one is HubSpot and the other is MailChimp. Particularly like a premium MailChimp account is going to give you a lot of those kind of core tools that you need to implement some of the strategies that we at least alluded to today. But those are kind of the two email systems I would consider that you or recommend that you consider looking into if you don't have a solid one in place. There's a ton of other tools we can look at. Solid analytics tools. I mean, using Google Analytics 4 is great, but making sure that it's set up properly to measure the right things, all that sort of stuff. There's so much we could dive into on the tech side, but I do think the kind of overarching principle there is to make sure you have data or tools that have databases that can talk to each other. Get data in, get data out without you having to go manually import, export everything, because that's going to take a ton of time and it's going to delay your ability to actually communicate instantly and effectively with your donors. All right, question from Cooper. How do you think about correlation versus causation? Are these digital first organizations just more proactive in managing their channels and or have more employee time attention focused on their giving strategies? I mean, that's honestly, that's kind of part of the point, is that many of these digital first organizations, particularly on the second piece of your question, are recognizing that you have to go structure things differently. You have to build new processes. You have to staff the right people that know how these different types of tools work, that can spend the intentional time on building the program in this way in order to see the results. So I guess it is causation, because you're making the intentional investment, not just in having the right tools, but also in the right people and the right process to go implement the strategies that are going to lead you off into the future, moving up into the right. So that's you asked a few different questions in there. Hopefully, I've answered that thoroughly. But it certainly is an investment that you have to make, and you're not just going to magically, see these results happen overnight just because you installed a new donation page tool or something like that. It's a strategic investment that needs a roadmap and a pathway and a pathway towards growth that we have to invest in. A question from Steve. Blackbaud reports that average digital donations are currently only 12 to 13%, growing 10% over year. Your group has 50% digital donations. Any comment? My comment is that Blackbaud is looking at an enormous data set of people that are using radically different approaches and strategies. And those are the types of reports that I'm kind of referring to when I talk about comparing to sort of the industry average or the status quo. That's not to say it's a bad report or anything like that. There's lots of great things that, I reference those reports all the time. They're really helpful to understand what's happening industry-wide, because the amount of Blackbaud users is enormous, but they don't all have sort of a cohesive approach. Yes, they have a cohesive tool, kind of. There's a wide variety of tools, though, that they have. But that's what I think the benefit is of a report like this, is these organizations have a cohesive approach, which is why they're seeing radically different results. So I would encourage you to consider that there's the industry averages, And then there's reports like this that look at how does a certain approach actually maybe help me eclipse what is the industry average and see growth moving up into the right much faster than what the average organization is seeing. I'm going to grab a quick sip and then we'll move on to Remy's question here. And again, just shout out to everyone who's given so much of your time today. It sounds like we've got 300 plus people that are still sticking around and diving deep into this data. So I'm really grateful for that. I'm grateful for you. Hopefully we're making the most of your time here. We'll keep powering through some of these questions. From Remy, did your benchmark study focus purely on growing revenues, or did you also look at constituent engagement versus digital first versus offline strategies? And then it sounds like particularly for alumni organizations or higher ed organizations. This is not looking at every single possibility of engagement. What our goal here to do was to look at, how does a kind of cohesive approach look at revenue growth overall and look at the larger fundraising program. There is an infinite amount of data that we could dive into to try to measure engagement, whether you're looking at things like email engagement rates, you're looking at web traffic activity, you're looking at engagement with events and all sorts of different programs that you might put on as an organization. So no, we did not get to that level. Otherwise, we would still be deep in the data for the next like 5 years, trying to go pull out all of that different stuff. So the focus of this, again, yes, was to look particularly at how this approach impacts growth overall, impacts revenue, as well as some of those kind of key, I would say, myths that exist out there in traditional fundraising thinking, of just the idea that online donors just aren't worth it. They're not as valuable. They don't retain as long. Well, it turns out with the right approach, the narrative is a little bit different. So good question. And a second one from Remy, what's the likelihood of converting a donor who gives more than once online in a year into a member or sustainer type donor? Did you look at such conversion data? We didn't pull that out exactly, but I can give you some insights on that too. Typically how we build new donor welcome series. Obviously, the goal of one of those is to onboard someone well, to cultivate them, to set them up for a longer term relationship, but also we're trying to move them into a position where they're willing to give a second gift. And the majority of the time when we build that out, the goal is actually not to just get them to give a second gift, but to actually upgrade to monthly. And so I would consider heavily implementing an approach like that into your onboarding series. We often have seen, looking at some different organizations, that there's significant second gift activity even within somebody's first 90 days. So if you can onboard them well, you can cultivate them well in that first few weeks to a 30-day period, there's a world where they might be willing to give a monthly gift to you after month 1 as they get into month 2. And so we should aim and look to do that in our cultivation series to get them to upgrade to that monthly recurring gift. Because I'm sure what's kind of woven into your question there is this assumption and reality that recurring donors are going to be some of your most valuable donors. They're going to retain much longer than just a one-time donor. They're going to have greater lifetime values than just a one-time donor. So anything we can do to kind of position our messaging to lead someone to engage with us in that type of relationship is going to pay dividends in the end. And honestly, it's much more effective and easy to do that through an online channel as well. Great question. And 2 questions from Remy, so thank you. Let's see, another one from an anonymous user here, but did you happen to look at whether recurring donors are better acquired via digital versus offline? You're testing the depths of my memorization of all the different reports that are my friend Brad, who heads up all of our digital analytics, has put together. Because I believe there was a question he dove into even a couple of months ago in a report that he likes to put out called Fun with Numbers. I don't remember the exact percentages and the exact rates there, but I can say anecdotally, I mean, if someone is giving to you online and engaging you with a digital channel, it's an easier strategy to cultivate them and lead them towards that recurring gift opportunity. Whereas if they're only giving offline, or maybe that's their primary point of engagement, that's a bit harder and takes a longer time, even just because of the reality of the mediums of communicating with someone in an offline channel. So even if they come in offline, you may consider using digital channels to try to get them to give that recurring gift in an online format. We actually saw, and maybe I'll scroll down there here in the report, we'll jump to retention. There's some interesting trends too, where we tend to think about donors and kind of their digital donors or their offline donors. And we as fundraisers, split them into these two buckets, into these two categories. But the reality is they're people, and the people that are on the other end are interacting with whatever's in front of them. Now, many of them may choose only to give offline, but that doesn't mean they're not interacting with you in your online channels. What we saw as we looked at second gift by channel for new donors is some pretty significant migration of where people gave for their second gift. I just like how these charts look, which is why I kept them in here, because I think they're kind of cool. But you can see, people who gave their first gift online, a percentage of them giving their second gift offline, and vice versa here. People who gave their first gift offline, a percentage migrating and giving their second gift in an online channel. And what we saw in total was that 18% of second gifts were made in a different channel. So while we have this tendency to bucket people into digital and offline as a channel and only communicate with them via those channels, the reality is that they're just people and they communicate and interact with the channel that's in front of them. So consider your new offline donor. They may want to get your email newsletter. They may want to get an onboarding series sent to their inbox, and that might be a way to move them into an online channel, which is where they might actually be their most valuable. In fact, another kind of little fun fact here is that whether they came in through online or offline, donors were most valuable if they gave their second gift in an online channel. So just file that one away. You can drill into that chart and that data too, but I thought that was pretty interesting. All right. We've got about 10 minutes, maybe 13 minutes here until we sign off. We got a lot more questions, so we'll try to go rapid fire through a few of these. We've got a question from David. He says, do you have a report on donation page conversion rates by session source? That would be interesting to see. I would love to see that also. The reality is that the way that we kind of split out the different types of pages, it does correlate a bit to session source. That's one way that we were able to sort of filter it down, particularly because like a campaign donation page is most likely oftentimes the traffic going to there is driven from an email appeal or some sort of dedicated source. Typically, people aren't finding those types of pages via organic search or even direct traffic, unless maybe you have a direct link in, say, a direct mail appeal. So that's kind of one of several filters we use to try to isolate some of those pages. But no, I don't have like a full breakdown of conversion by source. I think we might be able to get some of it, but I don't have it in front of me. Question from Pamela. Will you please define what you mean by digital first? Yes, and again, we've tried to define it a few different times throughout. I've got a kind of a short summary at the very top here about what it means to be digital first. But the short summary is that these organizations recognize that we live in a digital world and donors live in a digital world, and we have to adapt to that. And so instead of just bolting on a digital program like adding email and advertising to just your existing direct mail program, it's kind of shifting your focus, shifting your systems, processes, tools, methodologies, and even people to use digital channels as sort of the primary way that we build our program. It doesn't get rid of offline. It doesn't get rid of any of your other channels, but it's using digital first to lead your communication, which can actually lift kind of all channels and lift all boats. That's still, I know that's kind of high level, but it's also something we're continually working on codifying. Like, what are kind of the key elements that you need to have in place to be a digital first organization? And so we'll have more of that's coming out over time. Let's see, Dan. Hello, Dan. Were you able to look at online revenue driven by direct mail recipients? We probably have that somewhere in the data set. I don't have it in front of me to look at. I will say, and just kind of a plug here, a long-term plug, this is sort of phase one of an initiative that we're working on related to benchmarking, where we would love to have some deeper abilities for you to be able to plug in your data sources and all that sort of stuff to do some direct comparisons and look even deeper kind of into CRM records and all that stuff to even see metrics like this. So we're a ways out from having that. This is kind of the first iteration of this type of a report, but those are critical things and really interesting things that we'd love to dive into. I just don't have it quite at my fingertips yet. Question from Luke. Wondering, what are the best investments in digital fundraising for small organizations right now, where aggressive spending might not be possible? Well, Luke, one thing to note is that the way that, and if you go visit that kind of advertising section here, the way that we even built out this sort of chart on digital advertising and considering budgets is not about having to have some kind of minimum threshold of investment, but it's about aggressiveness depending on where you're at as an organization. In fact, you look at this chart, these bigger bubbles are the larger organizations. They have more overall revenue. But you've got smaller organizations in here too that are more at the probably a 4 to 5 million mark. Actually, you can see here's on the chart. The smallest in this data set is about 1.5 million in individual giving. So right about probably where you're at, or maybe a little bit higher. But that's why we built it this way. It's not a minimum threshold of how much you must spend, but really looking at it from the perspective of a percentage of what's being given. How do I go reinvest that into growth? So whether you're at $1 million or you're at 10 million bucks, you're at 500,000, consider that as kind of a baseline. You're probably more down here in this sort of building the program area, but you do have to make an intentional commitment. If you're wanting to see significant digital growth, we have to carve off a significant portion of budgets to invest that in digital for the sake of growing. Yeah, so hopefully that's helpful context. I would think of it, again, less as like a minimum threshold and more of a percentage of what you're bringing in, choosing to reinvest that into digital growth. Question from Tom. If you had $50,000 to $100,000 to invest in growing a nonprofit through digital marketing efforts, where would you spend it for the greatest ROI? Is there a particular online channel that you're seeing outperform others? Great question. And again, the consultant answer is it depends on where you're at. There's a few things that you probably want to focus on first. If you have nothing in place and you're a brand new organization, but you've got sort of a pot of money, I mean, the first thing you do is not go just dump it all into Facebook. You need some kind of basic things in place first. Obviously, have strong donation tools. You want to have a well-optimized page. Not that you're at a point where you can do lots of testing, but we have lots of templates based on previous research and testing that are a good starting place. You want to have some of the right tools in place in terms of a strong and modern CRM tool, again, that integrates with other tools. You can get data in and out in an automated way. Strong email tools and to develop some automated email communication to make sure you have a good baseline to cultivate people. What we would hate to do is go dump $100,000 in acquisition and have nothing in place in the back end to cultivate those people to lead to retention. Because if you end up seeing really low retention rates, it's probably not worth the investment to go acquire them in the first place. So we have to go build a little bit of that infrastructure first with cultivation, with resources, with content offers, things like that, so we can cultivate these people over time. So that's where I would spend my initial investment of both time and energy and just financial resources, is building some of that infrastructure first, and then go spend it on advertising, go spend it on acquisition, to go test the waters to see what kind of content and offers and things like that are going to stick and lead more people to signing up, subscribing, giving, and sticking around. Jamie, how do organizations typically gather data on donors acquired offline in order to cultivate that second, third, fourth gift? In an offline channel, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. That's not my world. So I'm not going to dive too deep in there, just because I can't claim to be an expert there. We do a ton of A/B testing in online channels, and we're doing more and more to see how these kind of interact. These two channels interact, where you can run things like branded campaigns over the top of direct mail campaigns in order to increase giving. And that's probably from a strategy perspective, is some things I would consider. How do you get these offline donors to cultivate that next gift? Is yes, continue to invest in your direct mail approach and direct mail strategy, but also consider, again, that they don't just live in one channel. These donors, whether they're Gen Z, boomers, above, are interacting in lots of different channels. So even if they never actually give in a digital channel, you can still cultivate them with emails, with your email digital newsletters, things like that, with other cultivation content, blogs and articles that you send out in a digital format, because you can do that faster and actually measure the engagement a lot better than you can in a direct mail channel. And also consider things like, can we run some other kind of branded cultivation, even advertising, so that as they're scrolling on Facebook, they see your organization come up, they receive value from you in content that you're sharing, so that they're more likely to go actually give when the direct mail appeal hits the inbox. We actually have an experiment on that in this benchmark report that you might check out. All right, we got 5 minutes and we got 4 questions. I think we can do it. Let's see. Alicia, have you seen or measured cases where you have a major donor who you would not want to sign up for a monthly gift? Say they make a significant yearly contribution. If someone has come in as a new donor or even a major donor and given you $10,000, $50,000, some significant amount of money, we're probably not going to try to get them to sign up to give on a monthly basis. They're someone that you want to cultivate well. You want to have a meaningful relationship, a one-to-one relationship with, making sure that they're on somebody's portfolio who's a major gift officer and they're checking in with them actively, having conversation, keeping them updated. But also consider that we don't necessarily want to fully remove them from communication either. Now, we probably don't want to solicit them for more money as often as we would someone who just came in and gave a $50 donation, but they may still be really interested and invested in your cultivation content. If you're sharing things like ebooks or surveys and articles and things like that that help them stay in touch with the organization they just made a major investment in, that's only going to help to build and further the relationship. In fact, we've actually seen cases where a new donor has come in, they've been cultivated on the email file, they got an ebook that they thought was really impactful, and then they ended up giving a $50,000 gift on an instant donation page. So some people are willing to make that type of investment even in an online channel. Make sure that we're using digital channels to cultivate those people, but definitely be careful of how you solicit them and make sure you have an intentional strategy around that. Susan says she's a huge fan of Next After. Thank you. I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for that encouragement. Have been for my first nonprofit job. Just wish I had the bandwidth and technology to implement every best practice you identify. Me too, Susan. Honestly, not every single organization we work with is doing all the same things because everyone is at a different stage of their growth and where they're at in their level of sophistication. And organizations with all the resources in the world still can't do everything. Sometimes smaller organizations outperform the bigger organizations in terms of sophistication because they can move faster. So everyone is at a different stage. I would highly encourage you, as I encourage everyone, to just continue to pick off what's the one thing I can do today. I can't do everything. I can't put everything on a big Gantt chart or something and go plan to do everything this year. But what can I do right now to take a step forward and optimize something, improve one thing, and take some on repeat baby steps forward, because before you know it, if you're doing that, you're going to start to see some significant returns. Christine would love to hear what surprised you the most about the report, whether positively or what gave you pause. I think that the stat that gave me the most surprise was on something that we often have talked about in different courses and things like that. It's like your most valuable donor is a multi-channel donor. But what we actually saw as we looked at 2023, and I shared this stat a moment ago, let me see if I can scroll back up to it, is actually looking at the value of these new donors by channel and where they give their second gift. Because regardless of if they came in online or offline, they were most valuable if their second gift came in an online channel. So an offline donor that converted to online, very valuable, much more valuable than if they stayed offline. An online donor who gave online in their second gift was actually more valuable than someone that cross channels, which is really interesting. So that gave me probably the most pause to think about and consider and double check the data, ask some questions to our data people. But it's really fascinating to see that with the right strategies, even an online donor can be this valuable and probably actually more valuable than an offline donor. I think it's really fascinating. Last question in 1 minute. Question from Indiana. What newer areas of digital fundraising do you think have the most potential for nonprofits? I actually want to not answer that question because in all the research that we conduct, I know it's really tempting to jump straight into what's all the most innovative stuff that we can be doing and talking about how do we integrate AI into all of our different programs and all this cool, use all the cool new tools. The reality is most people aren't doing the basic blocking and tackling. And even in a brand new research report that we're about to put out, we continue to see this trend that nearly half of organizations don't even send a thank you email within the first week, let alone larger communication over the first 90 days of someone being a new donor. So it's not a new area of digital fundraising, but I think the area that has the most potential for nonprofits is investing specifically in the basic blocking and tackling to make sure that people are onboarded and stewarded well as a new donor, because that's going to pay off in terms of leading towards a second gift, which can lead towards second year giving, which can lead towards key multi-year giving, and actually lift all metrics by increasing retention. So that's where the most potential is ensuring that we focus on kind of like that onboarding process of new donors. We have covered a lot in 60 minutes. Thank you again for sticking around. Thank you for giving an hour of your time today to go through this report with me. Again, there's so much more we could look at. I hope you check out the whole thing at benchmarks.nextafter.com. You can sign up on there to get on the waiting list to be the first to access kind of a self-assessment where you can actually go compare your results to this data set. It's not quite ready for you yet, but go sign up and we'll send you an email as soon as it's ready for you. Again, thank you for all you do. Thank you for all the work that you do every day to grow giving and grow generosity to fuel the impact of your organizations. We're grateful for you. I'm grateful for you. I hope you have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week. If you've got any questions at all, just shoot me an email, nathan@nextafter.com. I would love to hear from you. Take care. We'll see you later, and happy optimizing.